Welcome to Coffee Commerce. My name is Sean Ramett, and I'm the grandson of a coffee farmer from Guyana, South America. On Coffee Commerce, we talk about the stories behind coffee as they relate to culture, commerce, ideas. We've been talking about coffee houses in England, and now we want to talk about coffee and literature. The first account of the origin of coffee was written by Abd al-Qadir in 1587. It is the famous Arabian manuscript that commends the use of coffee, and it is preserved in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale. The writing is loosely translated as argument in favor of the legitimate use of coffee. Kawa is the word that is used for coffee, and it was the original use as an Arab word for coffee that eventually became the word that we have today, coffee. Other writings in that time are also of Arab descent, and they mainly focus on the history of the introduction of coffee into places such as Egypt, Damascus, Syria, Constantinople, and Aleppo. In this time period, Arabic poems on coffee also come out. Some of the names of these poems are translated as In the Praise of Coffee and Coffee Companionship. We also see in this time a book written about coffee called The Triumph of Coffee. A song was even written. One of the sheikhs of the day made up his own song concerning coffee, referring to it as the coffee of love. Early travelers made various contributions to coffee literature as well. This included Rowolf and Alpini. After that, there was Sir Anthony Shirley, Perry, Pidulph, Captain John Smith, Sir George Sandys, Sir Thomas Herbert, and Sir Henry Blount of England. Moving to France, we have Travanier, Thevenot, Bernier, de la Rouge. In Italy, Delia Valle. From Germany, Olerius and Niebuhr. And Holland, Nieuwhof. And there are others. Francis Bacon would write about coffee in the Vitae A Mortis and Silvarium in 1623 to 1627. Burton mentions coffee too in his Anatomy of Melancholy in 1632. Parkinson's describes the beverage in his Theatrum Botanicum in 1640. And of course, how can we forget Pascal Rosé, who we've talked about before, who published the famous Handbill in London, a literary effort, as well as the first splendid advertisement for coffee. Faustus Neron produced writings in Rome in 1671 and devoted solely to coffee. That same year, Dufour does something similar in France. This Dufour followed in 1684 with his work, The Manner of Making Coffee, Tea, and Chocolate. John Ray extolled the virtues of coffee in his Universal Botany of Plants, published in London in 1686. And other writings were published around this time too, in the late 1600s and the 1700s, about coffee, as well as tea and chocolate and other things. In 1727, Dr. James Douglas publishes in London his description of the history of the coffee tree. This work, laid under the contribution of many of the Italians, Germans, and French and English scholars that we've mentioned already, becomes a culmination of the works from before. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the poets and dramatists of France and England and Italy found a lot of good material written about coffee. And that's not to say that they weren't also inspired by the beverage and its cafes from that time period. French poets familiar with Latin first took coffee as a subject of their verse. Vanier sang its praises in the 8th book of his Praedium Rusticum and Felon. Even a Jesuit professor of Trinity College writes about coffee. A collection of the songs of Brittany in the Brest Library show many stanzas in the praise of coffee. Pope Leo XIII, in his Horatian poem on frugality, composed in his 88th year, has these verses to say in appreciation of coffee. Last comes the beverage of the ancient shore, mocha far off, the fragrant berries bore. Taste the dark fluid with a dainty lip. Digestion waits on the pleasure as you sip. Alexander Pope, the famous 1700s poet and satirist, has this famous line about coffee. Coffee which makes the politician wise, and see through all things with his half-shut eyes. Alexander Pope often awoke his servant at night by calling him to prepare a cup of coffee. By regular standard, this included grinding beans at the table and preparing it in front of Alexander Pope. Pope was a frequent patron of Will's Coffee House, along with other literary legends, including Dryden, Addison, and Steele. Even crumpets plays a role with coffee. In 1837, Coffee and Crumpets is published in Fraser's Magazine, and it becomes wildly quoted. Coffee in literature goes back to the beginning of coffee, which shows the importance of the beverage on the influence of the society of each and every time period and in each and every culture. This shows the importance that coffee had brought to these communities, not just in literature and in writings, but in other form of arts. But that's another story for another cup of coffee. Thank you.